Mr. O's Music. Hello, you lot, and welcome to Mr. O's Music. This week I'm going to be talking about an album from a group of whom you have probably heard, but whose music you may not have consciously at least listened to, the Divine Comedy. Before we get into it, I should introduce myself. My name is Richard Osmond, and I'm a music teacher in the UK, hence the Mr. O moniker. On this channel, I share with you every week an album which I've enjoyed and which may not be known by many of you. For copyright reasons, any clips I use are very short and are often supplemented by my own vocal interpretations, and I give my critical opinion of them as they play. I always put Spotify and Apple Music links to the full albums below the video, so you can go and explore them yourselves afterwards. So, to this week's album. The Divine Comedy are fronted by Neil Hannon, who, as well as lending his beautifully expressive voice to the tracks, is also credited with all of the composition. He is also an extraordinary lyricist, and you'll find that I will mention the lyrics more in this critique than I often will. I feel, however, a lot of credit should also go to Joby Talbot for his brilliant arrangements and orchestrations. As you'll see, I'll mention the orchestration frequently in my descriptions. Between the two of them, Hannon and Talbot have either individually or jointly been responsible for a lot of other music that you may have heard, particularly if you live in the UK. Theme tunes to various BBC shows such as Tomorrow's World, The League of Gentlemen, Father Ted, The IT Crowd, the soundtrack to the film The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and so on. The Divine Comedy's musical style has changed some over the years, but in the period of the late 90s and early 2000s from which this album hails, it generally contains a number of elements, summarised as often quite orchestral accompaniments, punctuated by galloping snare drum and jangly guitar or harpsichord. It's a very distinctive sound. But enough boring background, let's get to the music. We begin with the title track, introduced with a slow orchestral chorale, suddenly interrupted with the aforementioned jangly guitar and galloping snare. The lyrics begin with a toast to absent friends who are then variously described, and it turns out these are all people who seem to have died before their time, including one animal, Laika the dog, who was the first animal to orbit the Earth and was launched without any return plan. Musically, the song builds from verse to verse until the final verse when we have a slightly slower minor section. Oscar Wilde was a lonely child, before it explodes in joyful form as Hannon sings about Wilde being driven to his grave. This is typical Divine Comedy, cheerful music coupled to macabre lyrics, leaving the listener somewhat confused, but also with their interest piqued. Sticks and Stones settles into a sinister 8/8 time signature, meaning the pulses grouped into 3 plus 3 plus 2. And this makes you feel slightly uneasy. The opening lyrics, coupled with a chromatic descent, you and I go together like the molar and the drill. They don't make you feel any better about the direction the song may be heading, and the introduction of a guiro and French accordion, which I at least associate with the film 12 Monkeys, and that's not just because we're currently in COVID lockdown. None of this helps your feeling of unease. Snarling trumpets punctuate the texture and lead us into a glorious opening chorus in the major, in which Hannon reveals that sticks and stones may break my body, but words can tear me apart. Again, a confusing juxtaposition of music and lyrics, which works brilliantly. The next two songs are a lovely pairing, telling the story of a father and the trials of working away from home. Leaving Today begins with a solitary acoustic guitar as Hannon wakes to his morning alarm and leaves his house for what one assumes is a foreign trip for work. The build of strings as he says goodbye to his sleeping children is just achingly gorgeous, and the manner in which he wrenches his way through the lines, "I could stay if you asked me, so for God's sake, don't ask me to stay," before dropping back down for "My taxi has arrived. Goodbye, sweet, simple life. Goodbye," actually has in the past reduced me to tears. It's beautiful and gently segues into the slow introduction to Come Home Billy Bird, which turns into a comic romp through a man's attempt to get back home from a foreign business trip. Jangly guitars are to the fore, with each verse interrupted after only 14 bars, so 2 bars early, by a chorus with added harpsichord and backing female vocals entreating Come Home Billy Bird. This sudden interruption of the verse each time helps us feel some of the urgency of this poor man's plight. Each verse describes the man stumbling his way through a different crisis with masterfully different orchestrations for each, until the culmination of the song as we finally get a verse the right length of 16 bars. Excited chugging strings lead us to the final, previously unheard 2 bars of the verse, building dramatically to the grand reveal of why it is he's so desperate to get home, and it's worth the wait to find out. I can't tell you how powerful and masterful these two songs are, or the number of times I've used them in class as examples of great songwriting. Next, we have a lovely cheeky number. From the opening with the immediate playful question, "Would you like to meet my little friend?" and the reply from a banjo, imaginary friend grabs our attention and holds it through a beautiful harmonic turn at the end of each verse. It also holds the Osmond Award for the best use of the word peripatetically in a song. Not that I can think of its use in any other songs, to be honest. Answers in the comments, please, if you can think of one. It has a slightly bittersweet end as he laments the end of childhood and the loss of his imaginary friend. And it's at this point in the album that you begin to understand that the album's title is not only a reference to the first song, but sums up more broadly the subject material of the album as a whole. The middle track of the album, The Wreck of the Beautiful, is a mysteriously sad lament to a Navy flagship that is condemned to be decommissioned, and knowing its fate, sinks on its way to the wrecker's yard. A simple and beautiful song with a now familiar build from the very little to full orchestral texture. Not much more needs to be said, but a lovely change of pace from the two songs on either side. Our mutual friend, however, does need some describing. Beginning with the same 8/8 chug first heard in Sticks and Stones, Hannon tells us from the outset that this woman is someone he cannot forget. We're set up from the beginning to understand that this is a story of loss. He then proceeds to relate an innocent story of how he came to meet her through a mutual friend and how their own friendship progressed. A sinister grumping from cellos punctuates all of this as first violins chug and later woodwind chortle playfully over the top. Other beautiful moments include bass clarinet and bassoon alternating arpeggios and a gorgeous long oboe line as he describes his first conversation with this woman on his friend's settee. Following the setup and an instrumental, we come to the crux. Under slowly building, crunching harmonies, we get to the climax as Hannon reveals how the relationship ends. Violins leap up in mock fanfare at the crucial moment, and Hannon gently falls in defeat. Then follows the most extraordinary instrumental, lasting more than a third the length of the full song. The violins play long pedal notes at the top of their range, continually straining for the high tonic, only finally making it after more than a minute and a half. It's the most painful and yet powerful song. The Happy Goth, in contrast, is similar in character to Imaginary Friend, telling the story of a teenage goth who listens to sad music the whole time and dresses in black, but inside, she's happy. Musically, it has a gentle Cuban feel with lots of lovely percussion and some very interesting choices instrumentally, a jazz flute at the end, but most excitingly, a bass line played throughout by a very rude contrabassoon. So much fun. Next comes Freedom Road, an introspective look at a trucker who had a dream of the freedom of the open road, the excitement of visiting different towns, and the reality, which is nothing like that simple idealistic dream. A gentle rocking guitar takes us on a journey which builds with strings and French horns, with harpsichord punctuating the gaps between verses before the song ends sadly, with the driver realizing there's nothing for it but to abandon both trucking rig and dream. The penultimate track is entirely instrumental, bringing keyboards to the fore with the orchestral texture taking a backseat. A slow lament entitled Laika's Theme, presumably a reference to Laika the dog from the first song, it meanders beautifully, rising the whole time to a high, beautiful conclusion that then just begins to slide down in pitch on the fade-out, mirroring perhaps the rocket beginning to fall back to Earth as Laika's life also fades. Finally, we have Charmed Life, a wonderful ode to the singer's child describing how fortunate he considers himself to be. Everything comes together here. The banjo returns with the jangly guitars, the piano is joined by a beautiful celeste, and the full orchestra are clearly enjoying themselves, particularly when they launch into meandering chromatic triplets helping to describe rough seas in one verse. This is a wonderful conclusion to the album. After much of the really quite depressing lyrical and musical content and muddled messages from earlier, here we have a genuine ode to the joys of parenthood. Until the final few seconds, where instead of finishing happily in the tonic major as each verse has done before, the banjo drops down chromatically to an inconclusive submediant, leaving one to wonder whether even here Hannon is not always entirely happy. This is everything an album should be. Structured to take you on a journey, musically and lyrically ambitious, thought-provoking, annoying you hours afterwards with earworms and begging you to instantly listen to the whole thing again. It's not an album that is always easy to listen to, but it has phenomenal power. Go listen to it and follow it up perhaps with some of their other work from the same period. Short album about love and Fin de siècle are also stunning albums. For this week, though, that's it. Do please subscribe and click the bell and all that shenanigans so that you'll know when I drop the next one in about a week's time. Thanks for staying through to the end. Drop me a comment if you've got an album you'd like me to promote. I can't promise to do a video on it, but it'll make you feel like you're involved. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time. Mr. O's music, Mr.